May 17, 1943, Washington, D.C. Two men are sitting across from each other in a building that officially does not exist, about to sign an agreement that will not be acknowledged for nearly 50 years. The building is the headquarters of the Army's Signal Intelligence Service at Arlington Hall in Virginia, a former girls' school whose conversion to the most secret intelligence function in the American military establishment has been accomplished with the specific combination of institutional improvisation and operational urgency that characterizes every aspect of American signals intelligence work in 1943. The two men are Brigadier General Carter Clark, representing the United States Army's intelligence establishment, and Commander Edward Travis, director of Bletchley Park's Government Code and Cipher School since 1944, and the administrative head of the most productive intelligence operation in the history of the discipline, and the agreement they are about to finalize, the Broussard Agreement, whose full designation is the British United States Communications Intelligence Agreement, is the most significant intelligence treaty of the Second World War and one of the most significant intelligence agreements in the history of either nation. It formalizes what has been developing informally since the first Anglo-American intelligence cooperation of late 1940 and early 1941 into a specific and comprehensive framework for sharing the most sensitive intelligence product that either nation possesses, the decrypted communications of Germany's military and diplomatic systems, produced by the code-breaking operations that Britain has been running since before the war began, and that America has been building with increasing sophistication since Pearl Harbor. The agreement is classified at a level that places it above most wartime secrets, above the security classification of most operational intelligence product, above the classification of most strategic planning documents, in the specific category of material whose protection the intelligence establishments of both nations treat as a precondition for the alliance's continued intelligence effectiveness. If the agreement is known to exist, the activities it governs become more visible. If the activities become visible, the enemy knows that his communications are being read. If the enemy knows his communications are being read, he changes his systems. If he changes his systems, ultra ends. The classification of the Broussard Agreement is therefore not merely the classification of a treaty document, but the protection of the entire intelligence edifice that the treaty document governs, and the men who sign it understand this with the specific clarity of people who know that the thing they are signing is simultaneously the most important document they will ever sign, and the document whose existence must be the most carefully denied. The specific contents of what America has been contributing to this shared intelligence effort, the specific capabilities that the American Signals Intelligence Establishment has developed independently, and that Bletchley Park's own assessments have evaluated with the professional precision of an institution that understands the discipline at the highest level, will not become publicly available in any form that accurately represents the full picture until the systematic declassification reviews of the late 1980s and early 1990s produce the document releases that historians and the public have been waiting for since the ultra-secret first began to emerge in the 1970s, with F.W. Winterbotham's controversial 1974 book and the British government's subsequent authorization of limited official histories. What British intelligence said about American code-breaking, the specific assessments of American cryptanalytic capability, of American signals intelligence doctrine, and of the American contribution to the shared intelligence product that Broussard formalized, is one of the most revealing and least publicly known documents of the Second World War's intelligence history, and it describes an American contribution that the British intelligence community's official public communication, careful about revealing sources and methods, even decades after the war, had never fully characterized. The American Signals Intelligence Organization that Bletchley Park was evaluating in 1943 had grown from near zero in 1940 to an enterprise of extraordinary scale and increasing sophistication in 3 years of wartime expansion that mirrors the broader pattern of American military mobilization. The Signal Intelligence Service that William Friedman had built before the war, a small, academically oriented organization, staffed initially by a handful of men and women whose backgrounds in linguistics, mathematics, and classical scholarship had been identified as the specific combination of skills that cryptanalysis required, housed in the old munitions building on the Washington Mall in facilities whose size and budget reflect the pre-war Army's view of signals intelligence as a useful but not central intelligence function. whose primary achievement had been the breaking of Japan's purple diplomatic cipher in 1940, in an analytical feat that consumed a team of cryptanalysts for 18 months, and produced the daily stream of Japanese diplomatic traffic that the Americans called magic, was not yet in 1941 the organization that the war's demands required. It was too small, its personnel too few, and too specialized for the industrial-scale intelligence processing that the war would require. Its physical facilities, and its equipment budget, inadequate for operations at the scale and intensity that the American entry into the war would immediately demand. But it contained something that Bletchley Park's own analytical observers, when they made contact with their American counterparts through the liaison visits of 1941 and 1942, identified as a specific institutional quality whose development they had not expected to find at this stage of American cryptanalytic development, an analytical rigor and a mathematical sophistication that reflected the specific character of the American academic tradition that had produced the SIS's key personnel, and that was producing, in the first years of the war, advances in the theoretical foundations of cryptanalytic attack that the British system, which had developed its own cryptanalytic tradition through a more empirical and less mathematically formal route, had not anticipated from an organization this new to the highest levels of the discipline. William Friedman himself was the central figure in this tradition, a man whose 1923 paper on the index of coincidence had provided a mathematical foundation for frequency analysis attacks on polyalphabetic ciphers that the discipline had not previously possessed, and whose training of the personnel who would staff the SIS through the 1930s had produced a cadre of mathematically sophisticated cryptanalysts whose analytical approach to cipher systems was genuinely different from the British approach, and genuinely complementary to it. The British assessment of Friedman, available in the personal correspondence and professional communications of Bletchley Park's senior officers that subsequent archival research has recovered, in the evaluations that Gordon Welchman and Alan Turing and the other senior figures of the British cryptanalytic establishment produced in their private communications about the state of the shared Anglo-American analytical effort, describes him in terms that Bletchley's institutional culture extended only to the most accomplished practitioners as a cryptanalyst of the first rank, whose specific contribution to the theoretical foundations of the discipline was as significant as any practical code-breaking achievement, and whose influence on the American organization he had built could be measured in the quality of the cryptanalytic attacks that organization was producing on Japanese and German cipher systems in 1942 and 1943. Turing himself, whose own contributions to the mathematical foundations of the bombe and to the theoretical underpinnings of cryptanalytic attack represent the most significant individual intellectual contribution to the Bletchley operation, had visited the United States in November and December 1942 on a liaison mission that included visits to the Naval Communications Annex and to Arlington Hall, and his private reports on what he found there, available in the British National Archives intelligence files, describe an American cryptanalytic establishment whose mathematical sophistication he had not expected, and whose specific approach to several analytical problems he found genuinely illuminating. This is Alan Turing describing his American counterparts, the man who formalized the mathematical foundation of the bomb, who proved in theory what the bomb would demonstrate in practice, finding in the Americans he visited something that his own analytical framework recognized as the output of a comparable rigor applied through a different tradition. The assessment requires no further amplification. When Turing says that the Americans are doing work that illuminates his own thinking, the assessment requires no further amplification. The specific technical contribution that American signals intelligence made to the shared ultra-enterprise, the contribution that the Brusa Agreement formalized, and that British intelligence's internal assessments evaluated, with a candor that their external communications, protecting the source and the method, and the relationship that produced the intelligence, did not replicate, arrived in two distinct and complementary streams whose specific characters reflected the different targets, the different analytical traditions, and the different organizational resources that the two intelligence establishments brought to the shared enterprise. Understanding both streams is necessary for understanding the British assessment of the American contribution, because the British assessment addresses both the Japanese contribution in terms that acknowledge American primacy on this target, and the German contribution in terms that acknowledge the enabling role of the American industrial and engineering capacity in the shared Enigma operation. And because the British assessment's specific candor about both reflects the institutional honesty of a professional intelligence community evaluating its partner's work for internal rather than external purposes. The first was the American contribution to the attack on Japanese cipher systems, where the American Signals Security Agency, which absorbed and expanded the original SIS in 1943, and the Navy's OP-20G, had developed, independently of British cryptanalytic work and using different mathematical approaches, an analytical capability against Japanese military and diplomatic cipher systems that was in several specific respects superior to the British capability against the same targets. The Japanese purple machine cipher had been broken by Friedman's team in 1940, the cipher used by the Japanese Foreign Ministry for its highest-level diplomatic communications, a rotor-based machine cipher whose output the SIS had been collecting through intercept stations for years before the break, and whose specific mathematical structure Friedman and his team had reconstructed entirely from the traffic, without physical access to the machine itself, without any crib in the conventional sense, through a process of statistical analysis and inspired reconstruction that identified the electrical connections within a machine they had never seen, using a purely analytical approach that Bletchley Park's own cryptanalysts described in their professional assessments as one of the most impressive, purely analytical achievements in the history of the discipline. The purple break had been shared with the British in 1941 as part of the early intelligence exchange, and the British analytical community had received it with the specific professional respect of cryptanalysts, who understood what the analysis required. They had been unable to break purple themselves. The American team, working from traffic alone and from Friedman's mathematical framework, had succeeded. This was the beginning of the British professional assessment of American cryptanalytic capability. The subsequent American work on Japanese naval codes through 1942, which produced the intelligence that enabled the Coral Sea and Midway engagements, and which involved the Navy's cryptanalytic establishment at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, under Commander Joseph Rochefort, a man whose combination of cryptanalytic brilliance and personal eccentricity made him simultaneously the most valuable and the most difficult intelligence officer in the American naval establishment, whose insistence on his own analytical conclusions about the Japanese target for the Midway operation brought him into direct conflict with his superiors at Naval Communications in Washington, who reached a different conclusion from the same traffic, and who was proved decisively correct by the outcome of the battle, and subsequently relieved of his command in a bureaucratic reversal that the intelligence community's official history has spent decades trying to explain, was evaluated by British liaison officers with the professional assessment of men who understood what the Japanese naval cipher represented as a cryptanalytic target. JN-25 was not Enigma. It was an additive cipher system of considerable complexity, regularly changed and supplemented with the specific security measures that the Japanese Navy had built into its communications after the perceived compromises of earlier systems, and breaking it required not the mechanical processing approach of the Bombay, but the patient, iterative analytical work of teams of cryptanalysts who were reading partial solutions from high-volume intercept and using each partial solution to extend the next. The British who found the American solution to it, the specific analytical attack that Rochefort's team mounted against JN-25 in the months before Midway, found it to be a cryptanalytic achievement of the first order, whose operational consequences were directly visible in the Pacific War's most consequential naval engagements. June 4, 1942. The waters northwest of Midway Atoll, North Pacific. 4 Japanese fleet carriers are in position for what their commanders believe is a decisive ambush of the American carrier force that the Midway operation has been designed to draw into a killing ground, and they do not know that the American commanders know they are there. They do not know that Station Hypo's cryptanalysts have been reading their communications, that Rochefort's team has identified Midway as the Japanese target from the specific pattern of traffic that JN-25's partial decryption has made available, and that the American carrier force whose destruction the Japanese plan requires is not approaching from the south and west, as the Japanese intelligence assessment has projected, but is waiting northeast of the atoll, in a position that the knowledge of the Japanese plan has made possible, and that the Japanese plan has not accounted for. The dive bombers from the USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown that find the Japanese carriers at 1022 hours on June 4th find them because American codebreaking has put them in the right place at the right time to find them. The carriers are found with their flight decks covered in rearming aircraft, with aviation fuel running in exposed lines across the deck, with bombs that have been switched from land attack to anti-ship configuration, and switched back again in the frantic morning of decision that Nagumo's command has experienced since the first American carrier contact report arrived. The dive bombers fall from high altitude, and the Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, begin to burn in the way that ships full of aviation fuel and half-armed aircraft burn, catastrophically, with secondary explosions that the damage control crews cannot contain because the damage is everywhere simultaneously. 5 minutes, 3 aircraft carriers. The most consequential 5 minutes in the history of the Pacific War. The 5 minutes in which 3 Japanese fleet carriers begin the process of burning beyond recovery are made possible by an analytical achievement whose specific character the British intelligence assessment will evaluate with a precision that the public record of the 1940s and 1950s does not reflect, that the American code-breaking of JN-25 in the months before Midway represents a cryptanalytic attack on a system of a complexity and a security design that the intelligence establishments of 1942 had not previously broken under comparable conditions, conducted by men who had been doing this work for less than 2 years and who produced a result that changed the course of the Pacific War. The British assessment of this achievement, available in the liaison communications that passed between GCCs and Station Hypo's American counterparts, and in the evaluations that British cryptanalytic officers produced of the American analytical approach to JN-25, describes it with the specific and measured language of institutional peer review. This is a significant contribution to the shared intelligence effort, whose methodology and whose outcome reflect a cryptanalytic capability that has matured faster than we projected. This is not the language of enthusiastic praise. It is the language of professional assessment from an institution that invented many of the analytical tools that the Americans have applied to JN-25, and that finds in the application a quality and a speed that its initial assessment of American capability had not projected as achievable on this timeline. The near failure in the Anglo-American intelligence sharing relationship, the moment that comes closest to disrupting the cooperation that Brusa formalizes and that the shared intelligence product depends on, arrives not in 1943, but in the period of 1941 and 1942, when the British intelligence establishment is in the process of deciding how much to share with an American establishment whose security standards and whose cryptanalytic capability it has not yet fully evaluated. The specific British concern in this period is documented in the internal communications of GCCs and MI6, with a frankness that the public record of the wartime alliance does not contain. That the American intelligence establishment of 1941 and early 1942 has not yet demonstrated the security discipline and the organizational sophistication that the material being shared requires, and that the specific operational consequences of a compromise, the loss of the ultra source, the loss of the intelligence advantage that has been the most important single asset of British military planning since the breaking of Enigma, would be catastrophic in ways that no tactical or strategic benefit from sharing could compensate for. The British withhold from the Americans in 1941 and early 1942 the full scope of the Enigma operation, the existence of the bombs, the scale of the Bletchley Park operation, the specific methods that have produced Ultra, not because they distrust American intentions, but because they distrust, on professional grounds and with specific evidence from the security reviews that British liaison officers conduct of American intelligence facilities, the American establishment's institutional readiness to protect the source at the level that its protection requires. The Americans, in the British assessment of this period, are not careless, they are new, and the specific kind of institutional security discipline that protecting Ultra requires is the kind that only comes from the experience of knowing what is at risk, from the specific and operational understanding of what happens if the source is compromised. Understanding that the British have acquired through 3 years of managing Ultra and through the specific operational consequences of the near compromises that have occurred and that the operational record has allowed them to identify. The British security reviews of American intelligence facilities in 1941 and early 1942 identify specific concerns that their internal communications describe, with the directness of professional intelligence officers making a security assessment. The physical security of the American facilities is inadequate by Bletchley Park's standard. The need-to-know discipline within American intelligence organizations is not as rigorously enforced as ultra-protection requires, and the specific compartmentalization procedures that Bletchley Park has developed through hard experience to prevent any single individual from possessing enough information to compromise the source are not yet present in the American intelligence system in the forms that BRUSA will eventually require. The American intelligence establishment of 1941 does not yet have the institutional experience in the form that the British assessment requires before full sharing can be authorized. The knowledge that ultra is at stake, in the specific way that the British intelligence officers managing it know that it is at stake, is the knowledge that comes from having managed it long enough to understand what its loss would mean for the operational plans that depend on it. And the Americans, who have been building their intelligence organization since Pearl Harbor, have not yet accumulated that specific kind of institutional knowledge in the depth that the British risk assessment requires. The resolution of this near failure, the decision to extend full sharing, which the BRUSA Agreement of May 1943 formalizes, is driven by the specific and growing evidence of American cryptanalytic capability and American security improvement that the preceding 18 months of partial cooperation have produced. The British assessment of American intelligence security through 1942 tracks a specific improvement in the institutional discipline that full sharing requires, and the BRUSA Agreement is the formal acknowledgement that the improvement has reached the threshold that British risk assessment accepts as adequate. It is, in the British assessment's own specific formulation, a decision to trust, not blindly, and not without the specific verification mechanisms that BRUSA builds into its coordination structure, but genuinely, on the basis of accumulated evidence that the American intelligence establishment has become what the shared enterprise requires. The German Enigma contribution to the shared Ultra product, the American contribution to the attack on German cipher systems that Britain had been running since 1939, and that the Americans joined at Bletchley Park's invitation in the months following Pearl Harbor, is the least publicly known and in many respects the most technically impressive aspect of the American signals intelligence contribution. The Americans who arrived at Bletchley Park from late 1942 onward came from the Naval Communications Annex at Nebraska Avenue in Washington and from Arlington Hall, and they brought with them a combination of engineering capability and mathematical sophistication that Bletchley Park's Hut 8 and Hut 6 found immediately useful, and whose specific technical contributions, most notably the American effort to build high-speed bomb machines, the American naval contribution to the capture of Enigma materials from weather ships and U-boats, that provided the cribs necessary for some of the most productive British bomb runs, and the American development of the early digital computing approaches to cryptanalytic attack that would eventually produce the machines that succeeded the bombs, represent a contribution to the shared Enigma operation that the British assessment describes, in its internal evaluations, as technically significant and in several specific respects, enabling the American Bombay program, authorized by Admiral Harold Stark in December 1942, and developed by the Naval Computing Machine Laboratory at the National Cash Register Company in Dayton, Ohio, the NCR engineers who received the technical specifications from the American Naval Cryptanalytic Team and who apply to the problem the same precision manufacturing capability that has been producing cash registers and tabulating machines for decades, now applied to the problem of building the rotating electromagnetic devices that test Enigma wheel configurations against intercepted traffic at speeds that human analysis cannot approach, produces 120 naval bombs by 1944. This figure exceeds British bomb production over the same period. It exceeds it because American precision manufacturing capacity, applied to the specific engineering requirements of the Bombay, produces machines faster and in greater numbers than the British manufacturing establishment, already stretched by wartime demands across multiple defense production priorities, can match. The British assessment of the Dayton bomb program, circulated within the intelligence community whose operation the bombs serve, describes it as an engineering achievement whose scale and speed reflect the specific American industrial capacity for precision manufacturing at volume that the British program, operating within more constrained industrial resources, has not been able to match. This is the British intelligence community acknowledging that the Americans are producing more of a device that the British invented, faster than the British can produce it. This is the assessment that the public record would not contain for another 50 years. The bombs do not produce intelligence by themselves. They are tools whose effectiveness depends on the cryptanalytic analysis that identifies the right menu for a particular day's traffic, the specific configuration of Enigma wheel positions and plugboard settings that the bomb will test against the day's intercepted traffic to find the settings that produce intelligible German. A bomb bay without a menu is a machine running through configurations at high speed, with no analytical guidance about which configurations are worth testing first. The menu is everything. The specific result of the cryptanalysts' work in identifying cribs, the probable plaintexts that allow the computational attack to be directed rather than exhaustive, whose identification requires understanding the German military's communication patterns well enough to predict what message content will appear in specific traffic at specific times, and whose application to the bomb run reduces the search space from billions of configurations to thousands. The Americans at Nebraska Avenue, who are producing the menus for the Dayton bombs, are doing this work in the specific analytical tradition that Friedman established, and that the war has refined through 2 years of attacking Japanese cipher systems with the same patient, iterative, crib-based approach that JN-25 required. They are applying this tradition to the Enigma problem, with the result that the British assessment finds genuinely significant. A different analytical culture, approaching the same problem through partially different methods, and producing results that complement, rather than replicate, what the British analytical culture has been producing at Bletchley Park. The Americans who produce that analysis, the cryptanalysts at Nebraska Avenue who are doing the naval Enigma work, are doing it with the specific mathematical framework that the Friedman tradition has built, and that the British cryptanalytic system, assessing their work through the liaison channels that Bruce has formalized, finds to be the work of analysts who have understood the problem and are solving it at a level that the shared enterprise requires. By the end of the war in 1945, the Anglo-American intelligence sharing relationship formalized in Bruce has produced the most extensive and most productive intelligence cooperation in the history of either nation, and the British assessment of the American contribution, preserved in the operational records of GCCs, in the post-war analyses that British intelligence conducted of the shared enterprise, and in the personal accounts of the British cryptanalysts and intelligence officers who participated in the cooperation, is an assessment that the subsequent decades of classification prevented from entering the public record in the form that accurately represents it. When the declassification reviews of the late 1980s and early 1990s began producing the document releases that made the full scope of the Anglo-American intelligence sharing visible for the first time, releasing not merely the Ultra story, which had been partially public since Winterbotham's 1974 book, but the specific British assessments of American capability and the specific American contributions to the shared enterprise that previous releases had not captured. The picture that emerged differed from the popular narrative of Ultra as primarily a British achievement in specific and important ways. The American contribution to the JN-25 attacks that made Midway possible, the American bomb production program that accelerated the Enigma reading operation in the war's final 2 years, the American mathematical and engineering contributions to the theoretical foundations of cryptanalytic attack, whose influence extended into the design of the Colossus machines that cracked the Lorenz cipher used for German high command communications. These were not addenda to the British achievement. They were integral components of a shared enterprise whose specific division of labor reflected the complementary strengths of 2 intelligence establishments that had, through 3 years of wartime cooperation, developed a professional relationship whose closeness and whose mutual respect exceeded anything that the formal documents of the alliance captured. A relationship forged in the specific and daily experience of sharing secrets of such consequence that the sharing itself required absolute trust, of working on problems whose solution changed the outcomes of battles while the battles were being fought, of understanding that the work they were doing in offices and huts and in converted girls' schools in Scotland and Virginia was deciding whether men lived or died on beaches and in convoys that neither the cryptanalysts nor the communications interceptors ever saw, and in many cases never heard about, because the security that protected the intelligence source also protected the cryptanalysts from knowing the full consequences of their own work. The intelligence analyst who broke the day's Enigma settings at Bletchley Park at 0300 hours in January 1943 did not know that the settings she had broken would allow the convoy routing office to redirect a convoy away from the U-boat patrol that the decoded message had identified. She knew the settings. The settings were what she was there to produce. The consequence was managed by people she would never meet, in a compartment she could not access, to protect a convoy of men she would never know existed. The men and women at Arlington Hall, the former girls' school in Virginia that has become the largest signals intelligence facility in the world, employing by 1945 more than 7,000 analysts, linguists, mathematicians, and communications personnel on a campus whose growth from its 1942 origins has been one of the most rapid institutional expansions in the history of American intelligence. Working the Japanese cipher systems and the men and women at Bletchley Park working the German systems were not two separate communities sharing outputs. They were, by 1944, a single professional community working in two locations, sharing methods and personnel and analytical insights through channels that Broussard had formalized, and that daily contact between the establishments had made routine. The British cryptanalyst who visited Arlington Hall in 1944 found colleagues whose analytical approaches he recognized as variants of his own, applying tools he had helped develop to targets he had worked on, producing results that the shared enterprise was using in ways that neither establishment could have produced alone. The connection forged at the highest crisis of the war endured in the intelligence structure of the post-war world, an alliance beneath the alliance, the most consequential professional partnership in the history of intelligence. What British intelligence said about American code-breaking, in the private assessments that the classification system kept from public view for decades, in the internal evaluations of the GCCs, in the post-war analyses that the signals intelligence community produced of what the shared enterprise had achieved and how the American contribution had shaped it, in the personal accounts of the British officers who had worked alongside the Americans and whose professional evaluations carried the specific weight of direct operational experience, was that the American contribution was larger, more technically sophisticated, and more strategically consequential than the publicly available record had suggested. It was not a supporting role. It was a partnership of equals who brought different strengths to a common enterprise, whose specific strengths were different enough that the enterprise required both, and whose combination produced an intelligence capability that neither nation could have produced alone on the timeline the war required. It was the professional assessment of one intelligence establishment, evaluating another's contribution to a shared project. And it was honest in the way that professional assessments are honest, when the audience is the institution itself, rather than the public. It acknowledged what the Americans had contributed, with the specific and measured precision of men who understood the discipline at its highest level, and who recognized in the American contribution the work of analysts and engineers who had understood the discipline at the same level and had applied that understanding to consequences that the war's outcome reflects. The men and women who broke the codes, on both sides of the Atlantic, in both languages, with different mathematical tools and different organizational traditions, were doing something that the world they were protecting did not know about and could not have fully appreciated even if it had. The assessment that British intelligence made of their American partners is the honest professional record of what they actually did. It says what the public record, for nearly 50 years, did not say: that the American contribution was equal, was essential, and was irreplaceable.